Part 1. The Road to a Philosopher. The world is not limited to what is visible. What is invisible is sometimes more real. Plato. The year is 427 BCE. The sun pours down like gold upon the stone-paved roads of Athens. Among the shadows of olive trees, the voices echoing through the dust-covered limestone streets sound like the heartbeat of the city where philosophy was born. This is not just an ancient city. It is the home of thought, the cradle of inquiry, and the birthplace of eternal pursuit. Every child born in Athens in those days was a citizen, but some were more than that. One of those children opened his eyes to the world in an aristocratic household. His name was Aristocles, but history would come to know him by another name, Plato. Here, the narrator takes a step back, because this is not merely the story of a man. It is the story of a journey in which the mind strives to go beyond what the eye can see. It is the story of a man who wished to look behind the curtain of reality, a philosopher who searched for truth not just in matter, but in thought. City where Plato was born was a laboratory of democracy. The people elected their rulers. The debates in the Agora were the precursors of today's political discussions. But this democracy was often just a gloss on the surface. Beneath it lay struggles for power, class divisions, and the looming shadow of war. Plato's family lineage traced back to Solon, the ancient lawmaker of Athens. His father Ariston came from one of the city's prominent families, and his mother Pryxian was a symbol of wisdom. Raised in such a household, the boy grew up immersed in a politically charged environment. Yet Aristocles, or Plato, as he would later be known, was interested not just in politics, but in truth itself. Even as a child, he was different. He didn't just ask what something was, but why it was. When the wind blew, he didn't ask why the trees swayed. He asked what the wind itself was. When he gazed at the stars, he pondered not their distance, but why they were arranged in such a pattern. Even while playing, he sought order, meaning. His mind longed for what lay beyond the visible. His first teachers introduced him to mythology. But even as a child, he felt the growing pains of the transition from mythos to logos. He did not question the gods' quarrels, but the reasons behind them. And one day, he would meet the person who would transform him, Socrates. But the road to Socrates had not yet begun. First, he would have to witness the changing face of a nation, the shadow of wars, and the downfall of the expanding Athenian empire. Plato's world was shaped not only by philosophy, but by historical, political, and personal conflicts. They say one is not born a philosopher, one becomes one. But some are born to think. Plato was one of them. The city of his birth gave him both the subjects to think about and the battleground on which to wrestle with those thoughts. This is more than the life story of a philosopher. This is the story of how thinking transforms a person. It is the tale of how the soul rises beyond the body into the world of ideas. And this tale is rewritten in every age, for Plato still speaks. And now, we begin this journey with you. Quiet your heart, open your mind, because this may not only be Plato's. Search, it might become yours as well. Part 2. A child named Aristocles. The wind blew gently through the olive groves of Athens. It was springtime. Just as nature was awakening, a new life was beginning in a home as well. The child named Aristocles would one day become the bearer of ideas that would influence not only his own era, but a world still discussed thousands of years later. But on that day, he was merely a baby. His soft skin was not yet touched by questions, only by the warmth of his mother's embrace. His family was among the leading aristocrats of Athens. His father, Ariston, belonged to a lineage that claimed descent from the legendary King Codrus. Honor, tradition, virtue, these were sacred values in Ariston's world. His mother, Pryxian, was both intelligent and wise. her ancestry traced back to Solon, one of Athens' most important lawmakers. To be born into such a house meant not only a life of privilege, but also one of great responsibility. For those born into such a lineage were raised not merely to live, but to serve as examples to their society. The name Aristocles would later be replaced by another, Plato, due to the broad shoulders he developed from wrestling at a young age. Platon in Greek means broad, but over time, that breadth would manifest not only in his shoulders, but in the scope of his thought as well. Their home was near the center of Athens, at the heart of cultural and intellectual exchange. Growing up in this environment, Plato was immersed in both art and politics. The verses of Homer echoed through the walls of his home. At dinner, the elders debated political matters. And even as a child, Plato was a silent but attentive listener to these conversations. His childhood, at first glance, might not have seemed different from that of any aristocratic child. He was educated by private tutors. Music, geometry, literature, gymnastics, He was introduced to the 4 pillars of ancient Greek education. Yet what set him apart was not just repeating what he learned, but striving to understand it. When his teacher explained a mathematical formula, he questioned not only the result, but why it was so. From a young age, Plato had a deep fascination with nature. He would sit for hours beneath the olive trees, gaze at the stars, and try to understand the order behind the moving dots in the sky. No one had told him to do this. No one had said, question things. But his soul, from the very beginning, carried a kind of inner unrest, a quiet rebellion perhaps. The visible world was not enough for him. After his father's death, his mother Pyrrhiction remarried. Her new husband, Pyrilampus, was a well-known politician in Athens. This marriage brought Plato closer to matters of state at an early age. But his interest in politics would later turn to disappointment, for he would see that in a system ruled by power rather than virtue, there was little room for morality. His family expected him to rise in the political arena. But inwardly, he was being pulled in a different direction. Something was drawing his soul, something he could not yet name, but this pull would one day lead him to the path of Socrates. Those days marked the beginning of a transformation within his subconscious. He was not yet a philosopher. He had not yet asked most of his questions. But a growing emptiness inside, a discomfort with the distortions of the world, was present. That discomfort would be the very spark that pushed him toward philosophy for the rest of his life. Plato's childhood, in retrospect, resembles the opening scene of a silent yet meaningful film. The city where he was born, his family, his environment, all were woven together to shape him into a laborer of thought. Yet the pieces were not fully in place. There was only a distant echo in the background. Reality is not as it seems. And thus, the child born as Aristocles would one day become Plato, and forever change the face of human thought. Part 3. Growing up in the shadow of as Plato entered his youth. Athens was not only the center of philosophy, but also a hotbed of political turmoil. These were the years of one of the greatest tragedies in the Greek world, the Peloponnesian Wars. On one side stood Athens, governed by democracy. On the other, Sparta, ruled by an oligarchic system. 2 worldviews, 2 political orders, 2 ways of life were clashing. And young Plato was growing up in the heart of that collision. At dinner tables in his home, heated debates were common. After the death of Pericles, Athenian democracy had begun to decay under the hands of new rulers. Politics was no longer a matter of virtue, but a game of power and interest. Figures like Critias and Charmides, relatives of Plato, would later become key actors in the regime of the 30 tyrants. Even Plato's inner circle was increasingly divided under the shadow of political power. The young Plato was being exposed to both the rhetoric of freedom and the harsh reality of tyranny dot in this atmosphere. The first philosophical questions began to sprout in his mind. What is justice? Who defines what is right? Is a state legitimate merely through majority approval or through its alignment with truth? These questions didn't arise from books. They came directly from life itself. Having grown up immersed in poetry and geometry, Plato was now seeking truth, not only in the beauty of art, but also within the rot of political decay. Yet, this intellectual awakening would remain incomplete until he encountered a teacher. And around this time, the name of one man began to reach his ears more and more frequently. Socrates, this old man, who wandered barefoot through the streets of Athens, gave no lectures, accepted no fees. He didn't visit temples or appear in theaters. Instead, he would engage young people in the city squares, urging them to question their own beliefs. "I know nothing," he would say. But this claim of ignorance was, in truth, his sharpest. Wisdom. It revealed that asking questions was more valuable than merely possessing answers. One day, Plato went to listen to Socrates, and from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. Socrates' voice was not loud, but it was deep. His dialogues, laced with logical traps, often turned people against their own ideas. He was a mirror to the thinking self. Young Plato was captivated by this method. The way Socrates made abstract concepts like justice, virtue, and knowledge tangible completely overturned Plato's understanding of the world. That day, Plato realized something fundamental. Reality did not only reside in the external world, it could also be constructed within the mind. There must be an order behind the world perceived by the senses. The senses might deceive us, but reason was the key to reaching the realm of ideas. Socrates taught him the method, to question, to doubt, but ultimately to reach truth through inner coherence. And Socrates never told Plato what to think. Instead, he taught him how to think. Perhaps that's why Socrates left behind no written works. Yet he sparked a revolution in the minds of his students. For Plato, everything now appeared differently. While Athens was drowning in wars and political chaos, he had begun to build an internal system. Concepts like reality, justice, virtue, and the ideal state were taking shape within his mind. Socrates was not just a teacher, he was a spark. And Plato's soul was ready to catch fire. Part 4. The Death of Socrates. The beginning of a silent Revout in one morning. Athens awoke to a dark uproar. The city was not burning, nor were enemies at the gates. But something worse had happened. Truth was on trial. Socrates was being prosecuted in an Athenian court. The charges seemed simple: corrupting the minds of the youth, not believing in the state's gods, inventing new deities. But the real crime lay deeper. Socrates had questioned. And for a city-state, especially one in the hands of a corrupt regime, questioning was the greatest threat of all. Plato was not in the courtroom. But like everyone who heard the news, he knew this was not a pursuit of justice. It was an operation of silence. Silencing Socrates meant shattering the mirror, for that mirror reflected the rottenness of Athens. As a result of the trial, Socrates was sentenced to death. He was to die by drinking poison. This was not merely the death of a man. In Plato's eyes, it was the official execution of the philosopher, of truth, and of free thought. The cup of poison... would become a lasting symbol for Plato. He would immortalize that moment years later in his dialogue Phaedo. Surrounded by friends, Socrates remained calm, even at the edge of death. The soul reaches true knowledge when separated from the body, he said. He did not fear death. He saw it as the beginning of a journey. Inside, Plato was shattered. He lost not only his teacher, but his direction, his faith, perhaps even the conscience of a city. The lofty words of Athenian democracy and citizen participation now rang hollow to him. After all, the people had sentenced a wise man to death. By majority vote, at that point, Plato realized that philosophy was not just an individual quest, it was also a political struggle. Because if a society cannot think rightly, it cannot govern rightly. And right thinking must often side not with the people, but with the truth. This event ignited in Plato a decision to transform his rebellion into knowledge. He would write. He would speak. He would preserve the legacy of Socrates, not just in his heart, but through words. But with one major difference. He would no longer merely ask questions. He would begin to build systems. Plato distanced himself from Athens. For a while. He needed time to reflect, to regroup, to make sense of what had happened. The anger that boiled within him slowly crystallized. It became text. It became dialogues. And in each of those dialogues, Socrates began to speak once more. But Plato's. Socrates was no longer just a shadow of the past. Now, alongside Socrates' voice, Plato's own voice began to rise. The questions grew, the answers deepened. The death of Socrates was not an end for Plato. It was a beginning. From that moment on, Plato was not just a thinker, but a builder. He began to shape philosophy, not only around the question of what should we think, but also how should we live. And with that death came a new birth. A philosopher who had sworn to redefine truth, beauty, and justice. Part 5. Journeys. A traveler in pursuit of Plato departed from Athens. He left behind not just a city, but a deep sense of disappointment. After the death of Socrates, the streets of Athens felt suffocating, and its walls like stones, whispering betrayal. He needed to breathe on different soil, to feed his questions with the wisdom of other civilizations. First stop, Egypt. This ancient civilization on the banks of the Nile seemed to him like a land of secrets. Pyramids built with timeless patience, temples constructed with mathematical precision, and a people who lived in harmony with the cosmos. Plato's journey here was not merely physical. Egypt's understanding of cosmic order, its belief in the immortality of the soul, and its tradition of wisdom conveyed through symbols, left a lasting imprint on his mind. Long conversations with Egyptian priests taught Plato the discipline of Eastern mysticism. The Egyptians guarded knowledge, passing it only to those who were truly ready. This idea would later echo in the philosophy of education at Plato's academy. Not everyone should know everything. Knowledge was a journey, a form of purification. From Egypt, he traveled west to the southern regions of Italy, particularly to the area known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. There, he followed the legacy of Pythagoras and the schools founded in his name. The belief that numbers were not just quantitative, but also sacred in nature, deeply reshaped Plato's view of the cosmos. The Pythagoreans believed that the universe was created in accordance with mathematical order. Numbers were not mere tools of measurement. They represented the very essence of being. When Plato encountered this view, it was as if a light had turned on. He, too, believed that a hidden order lay beyond the visible world. Thanks to the Pythagoreans, he found a name for that order, the idea. The world of ideas was filled not only with numbers, but with concepts. Beauty, goodness, justice. These were not things perceived by the senses, but truths grasped by the mind. And like mathematics, these truths were unchanging. Plato was no longer just a philosopher who asked questions. He had become a thinker who was constructing a system. During these travels, Plato also visited the island of Sicily, where he was invited to the court of the young tyrant Dionysius in the city of Syracuse. A palace was filled with luxury, splendor, and spectacle. But what caught Plato's interest was Dionysius' curiosity about philosophy. The young ruler wanted to base his reign on rational principles, and he saw Plato as the theorist who could design this structure, but things did not go as planned. Plato's philosophical approach soon clashed with the intrigues of the court. Tensions quickly arose. Dionysius' advisors began to see Plato as a threat, and before long, Plato was effectively banished from the court. According to some accounts, he was even put on a ship to be sold as a slave, but was rescued thanks to the support of his friends. This experience taught Plato a profound lesson about politics. Philosophers must rule, but unless rulers become philosophers, this is almost impossible. By the time he returned from these years of travel, Plato was no longer the same man. His eyes now read not only Athens, but the entire cosmos. He had fused Socratic inquiry, Egyptian sacred silence, Pythagorean mathematical order, and Sicilian political chaos into one vast understanding. And when he returned, a duty awaited him in Athens. It was time to found his own school, a place where the foundations of thought, education, and the ideal society would be laid. The journey he took in pursuit of truth had now reached a new stage, the moment when he would begin to build a truth of his own. Part 6. The Academy. Philosophies. First home. When Plato returned to Athens after years of travel, the city had changed greatly. But one thing remained the same. People were still fighting, twisting justice to suit themselves, and confusing truth with power. Years had passed since Socrates' death, but his voice still echoed in Plato's mind. With this state of mind, Plato took on a mission to institutionalize knowledge. Socrates had taught by wandering the streets, but this method was temporary and risky. Plato sought something more permanent. That path would be called the Academy. The Academy took its name from the place it was founded, a sacred grove just outside Athens, dedicated to a hero named Academos. Among olive trees, pines, and wild fig trees, this area would now become a home not only for nature, but for thought as well. Plato aimed not merely to transmit knowledge in this school, but to establish a way of life. The Academy was not just an educational institution. It was a state of mind, a journey. Students came not just to attend lectures, but to construct a shared truth together. The method of education was far from conventional. Plato based his lessons on the question and answer technique, just like his teacher Socrates. But here was the difference. The questions were no longer merely destructive, but also constructive. Plato was no longer just an inquirer. He was now an architect building a system of thought. The curriculum at the Academy was multidimensional. Geometry, because the universe was built on numerical order. Astronomy, because the movement of the stars reflected cosmic harmony. Music, because the harmony of sound trained the soul's depth. Dialectics, because truth could only emerge through rational inquiry. The phrase said to have been inscribed at the Academy's entrance captured its essence. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter. Here, this wasn't arrogance demanding math knowledge, but a call for intellectual discipline. The training of thought had to rise on a structured and logical foundation. In time, the Academy became more than just a place where Plato conveyed his ideas. It turned into a laboratory of philosophy. Students asked questions, debated with Plato, wrote texts, and developed a philosophical system together. Among them was one of the brightest minds, a student who would eventually forge his own path, Aristotle. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle was more than that of master and apprentice. It was the first major philosophical rift, echoing within philosophy itself. While Plato believed in the heavenly reality of the forms, Aristotle argued that reality could be understood within this world, in matter itself. But these differences didn't damage the soul of the Academy. On the contrary, they nourished it. Because the Academy was not built on the idea of one truth, but on the possibility of many paths to the truth. In time, the Academy became the intellectual heart of Athens. Politicians, artists, scientists, all encountered philosophy here. And the Academy's greatest success was this: it made philosophy not just the foundation of knowledge, but of a virtuous life. For Plato, the Academy was the reconstruction of Socrates' voice. This time, permanent, systematic, and protected. No longer on the streets, but growing in the shade of olive trees, philosophy had found a home. And so, Plato became not just a philosopher, but an institution builder. He offered not only conceptual contributions to philosophy, but a historical structure as well. The first home of thought, the Academy. Part 7. The World of Ideas. The reality behind reality. One morning, in the shaded gardens of the Academy, Plato turned to his students and said, "What you think is real is merely a shadow. What is truly real stands where your eyes cannot see." With this sentence began the allegory of the cave, Plato's way of expressing the essence of his philosophy. Imagine this. People are born in a cave. Their hands and feet are chained, and they can only face the cave wall. Behind them burns a fire. The shadows of objects passing in front of the fire are cast onto the wall, and the people take those shadows to be reality, because that's all they've ever seen. Until one of them breaks their chains and leaves the cave. At first, their eyes are blinded by the light. It hurts. But then they begin to see real objects, the sky, the sun, and they realize that what they once thought was real were merely reflections of reality. This person is the philosopher, the one who sees the truth, tries to understand it, and then returns to share it with others. According to Plato, the world is divided into two realms: the world perceived by the senses, changing, transforming, corruptible, in other words, temporary. The world grasped by the intellect, unchanging, eternal, pure, and perfect. This is the world of ideas. When we see a table, its shape may change, it may break, or be painted. But the ideal table in our minds never changes. According to Plato, this unchanging idea of the table is an idea. These ideas are timeless, spaceless, not perceived by the senses, but understood by the mind. Abstract concepts like beauty, justice, and goodness also have their own ideal forms. In the world, we only see things that are beautiful, but we can only grasp beauty itself, its idea, through reason. Plato's theory is not just a metaphysical claim, but also an epistemological one. For him, true knowledge isn't obtained through the senses, but through dialectic, that is, questioning and rational thinking. Because of this, Plato was also distant toward art and poetry. Artworks, he claimed, are copies of reality. A painter may draw a bed, but it is only a representation, a shadow of a real object. What truly exists is the idea of the bed. Plato's theory of ideas is not only philosophical, but also moral. According to him, a good life should not be guided by pleasure, but by knowledge of the ideas. That's why the idea of the good stood above all others. Like the sun, it illuminated and gave meaning to all the other ideas. And this is why Plato's cave allegory is so powerful. Until people break their chains, they live only among shadows. But the philosopher is the one who breaks free. They suffer, feel lonely in their quest for truth, but still return to share what they've seen. Because truth is not only a personal enlightenment, it is a social duty. Part 8. The Republic. The architecture of justice and the soul. As the sunset cast a golden silence over the stone streets of Athens, Plato entered the Academy, papyrus scrolls in hand. His eyes were those of an explorer, embarking on the infinite inner journey of a philosopher. What he was about to write was not just a text, but an echo of a profound question. What is justice? And thus began his masterpiece, the Republic. It was not merely a political theory, but a map of humanity itself. In this work, Plato explained the essence of justice by drawing a parallel Between the structure of the human soul and the structure of a state, the Republic is written as a dialogue. The central figure is once again Socrates. Along with him, characters like Polemarchus, Glaucon, and Erymanthus join the discussion. Together, they raise the fundamental questions. What is justice? Why is being just valuable? And this question goes beyond an individual's life. For Plato, there is a deep resemblance between the individual and the society. The structure of the state reflects the structure of the soul. Plato divides the human soul into three parts: rational part, logos; thought, reason, wisdom spirited; part, thymus, courage, determination; willpower appetitive part, epithemia, desires, pleasures, needs parallel to this. He divides the state into three classes. Rulers gives those who possess reason, guardians; soldiers gives those with will; and courage producers, farmers, artisans, merchants, gives those driven by desires. If each class performs its own role, just as each part of the soul does its own task, then justice emerges. Plato's concept of justice is that everyone does their own work and does not interfere in the roles of others. This is a kind of moral harmony. One of Plato's most revolutionary claims is this: either philosophers must become kings, or kings must become philosophers. Because, in his view, a person who lacks wisdom cannot rule the state. An ignorant leader deceives the people with shadows, but the philosopher is the one who sees the truth, and only they can govern in accordance with the idea of the good. Plato's view has sparked many debates throughout history, yet it has also captured the attention of modern thinkers from Thomas More to Karl Popper. Part 10. The Journey of the Soul, Love, Death, and Immortality, as the sun washed the stones of the Acropolis with a golden glow while setting. A silence reigned in the garden of the Academy. Young students were lost in thought, and Plato sat on a stone, gazing at the sky. The sky had always fascinated him because, to him, the essence of the soul was as infinite and mysterious as the stars. The wings of the soul. The story of Phaedrus in the dialogue Phaedrus. Plato describes the soul as a chariot with wings. This chariot has two wings. One soars toward lofty, pure, and sacred desires. The other succumbs to worldly pleasures. Heavy and prone to stray from the path, the soul finds itself in the struggle between these two wings. Love is the strongest driver of these wings. True love is a fire that elevates the soul and enlightens the mind. Through love, the soul ascends toward the world of ideas and attains true knowledge. Here, Plato speaks not only of physical desire, but also of a noble quest for wisdom. Love is the spark that reminds the soul of its forgotten ideals. This is called anamnesis, remembrance, because the soul forgets the world of ideas where it was born. But love leads it back there, in the shadow of the symposium. The illumination of love in the dialogue symposium. Different facets of love come together. At a banquet, some of Athens' wisest men speak one after another about love. Some describe love as bodily passion, others as spiritual devotion. Plato identifies the highest form of love as eros, creative, uplifting, a love that seeks beauty and goodness. Eros nourishes the human soul and carries it beyond reality. This work is Plato's most compelling treatment of love as a philosophical experience. Love is not only a personal feeling, but also a universal force reflected in souls. The magic of love is a journey that leads people to knowledge, beauty, and virtue beyond death. The silence of Phaedo finally, in the dialogue Phaedo, Plato narrates the moment of Socrates' death and the immortality of the soul. This text is like a philosophical lament, full of both sorrow and hope. As Socrates sipped the poison, he said to his friends, "The soul is immortal. Death is the soul's liberation from the chains of the body and its ascent into the pure light of reality." Plato here teaches that Death is not an end to fear, but rather a beginning. When the soul is freed from the temporary bonds of the body, it attains true existence. Hence, the goal of philosophy is to prepare the soul for this eternal journey. The Eternal Dance of the Soul read together. These three works reveal the depth of Plato's understanding of the soul. The soul is not merely a temporary guest of the body. Its true home is the unchanging world of ideas. Love is the sacred energy that leads the soul home. Death is the gateway to the soul's liberation. Plato's expression is poetic, flowing like a myth. His words carry not only thoughts, but the very vibrations of the soul, rising toward eternity. As night fell over the garden of the Academy, Plato's heart was filled with hope for the soul's endless journey. Each star was like a part of the soul, each dream a door opening beyond reality. And thus, Plato's philosophy was a journey not only of the mind, but also of the heart. The most fundamental question a person asks throughout life is, who am I? Where does my soul come from, and where does it go? Epilogue. A philosopher in pursuit of eternity, Plato was not merely a thinker. He became a guide beyond the ages, an explorer who delved into the depths of the human soul. His philosophy, resisting the passage of time, has illuminated the path for all who seek existence, knowledge, and justice. The legacy he left in the world of ideas, in the soul's eternal journey, and in the understanding of justice continues to shine as one of humanity's greatest treasures. As he said, true knowledge is the reward of those who rise from the shadows into the sunlight. And as long as we follow Plato's path, striving not only to understand the world, but also ourselves, that light will never fade.